what we need to do is basically tell them, no, this is not correct.
When an economic system collapses, everything else goes with it.
And the Argentinians have now lived this experience, and they are genuinely saying, let's try something new and different.
Something truly extraordinary may be taking place in Argentina right now. Something that's worth us all taking some time to wrap our heads around because, well, it has the potential to reshape not just Argentina, not just the entire South American continent, but actually it has the potential to reshape the political landscape on a global scale. So today here at the Aussie Wire News, we are proud to bring you a special episode all about what's happening right now in Argentina. But first I need to set the scene. And to truly understand what's happening now in Argentina, we need to start a little further north in the failed state of Venezuela. I had the pleasure of travelling to Venezuela with my wife in 2015. It was an eye-opening trip, even for me, someone who is politically aware, and I was well aware already of the devastation that the socialist government had wreaked on that once wealthy country. Venezuela was once in the top 10 wealthiest countries on earth, and similarly, Argentina actually used to be number one, the wealthiest nation on earth. Now, more than 40% of Argentinians live in poverty. But even that spectacular and devastating fall is nothing compared to Venezuela, where the average person has lost over 10 kilograms of body weight due to food shortages, and over 1/3 of all Venezuelans are suffering from actual malnutrition. Travelling there in 2015 was eye-opening to say the least. My wife and I spent a week in Caracas City, which at the time was the most dangerous place on earth outside of a war zone. Crimes like robbery, kidnapping, murder, people were being killed for a loaf of bread. We went there for a friend's wedding, which probably sounds crazy, but that's the truth. And when we packed our suitcase, we made sure to bring lots of toilet paper because the country had run out. Forget the scenes we saw during COVID lockdowns of people fighting over toilet paper. In Caracas City, there was no toilet paper left to fight over. We also brought with us over 420 condoms. Yes, you heard that right. Now, we were relatively newlyweds, but even so, 420 condoms for 1 week was overkill. But we knew the country hadn't just run out of toilet paper, it had run out of many things. In particular, it had run out of all of the things that the government had deemed to be essential. That's right. The government, declaring condoms essential, had made them disappear. The same thing happened with toilet paper, bottled water, basic food items, and much more. Everything the government declared essential was now all but impossible to find at any price. How can that happen? Well, it is a stark and brutal reminder of an uncomfortable truth, that the government almost always achieves the exact opposite of what it sets out to do. I'll say that again because once you wrap your mind around this concept, this truth, the world suddenly starts to make a lot more sense. The government almost always achieves the exact opposite of what it sets out to achieve. Why, you ask? Good question. It's because the government operates by coercion, by manipulating people to do what they don't want to do. If people already wanted to do the thing that the government was trying to make them do, then it wouldn't be necessary for the government to be involved. People would already be doing it. If the government is getting involved, by definition, it's because they're trying to change people's behaviour from the thing people want to do to something that they are, at the very least, less keen on doing. This is what economists call a distortion in the market. And pretty much everything the government does falls into this category of applying incentives or threats to change people's behaviour or distort the market. But how does that lead to the government almost always achieving the opposite? Well, let's go back to Venezuela to find out. The socialist government had been pursuing a bunch of socialist policies which were, well, socialist. And as a result, the cost of living was skyrocketing and people were hurting. If that sounds familiar, a little bit like Australia right now, well, you'd be right. People were unable to afford basic essentials like toilet paper, condoms, eggs, bottled water, etc. So to fix this problem, the government declared a long list of items to be essential. And they regulated the price down to a level that people could afford. This is what's called the first order effect, or basically the direct effect of a policy. They regulated the price, so the price went down. All well and good. They all lived happily ever after. Or at least that's what the socialist government thought was going to happen. What happens in reality, of course, is that people respond to the change and create what are called second and third order effects. With the shelf price of these essential items now regulated down to an affordable amount, the reality was that manufacturers and shopkeepers who made and stocked these items were losing money on every item they sold. So what did they do? Well, they didn't restock when they ran out. Why would they? They're in business to feed their own families, so they're not going to stock an item that costs them money and takes food and shelter away from their kids. So almost instantly, these essential items disappeared from the shelves. They went from being unaffordable to being unavailable, at least not in legal stores. You could buy them on the black market, of course, but now prices were even higher because it had suddenly become a very dangerous business to sell these essential items at a price that was actually sustainable. Now, you can add massive inflation due to absurd levels of money printing that made shopping for groceries feel like a drug deal with wads of cash, the nationalising of industry, which were subsequently run into the ground, and the heartbreaking social dysfunction that comes with any paranoid socialist government that wants nothing short of total control. And that, in a nutshell, is how one of the wealthiest countries on earth back in the 1940s came to have a chronic toilet paper and condom shortage and widespread malnutrition by the early 2000s. Since we were there in 2015, things have gotten even worse. The government has run completely out of money. Their free healthcare system is broken to the point that they're reusing bandages and even reusing scalpels and needles because there's no government budget to buy more. A friend in Venezuela told me how someone he knew, whose daughter was expecting her first child, that the father was afraid that if anything went wrong, she'd die in the hospital, probably from an infection from a secondhand scalpel. So the father sold everything and travelled to the border with Colombia, where he basically handed over their entire life savings to an illegal smuggler in return for a medical kit, a bag that contained crazy medical luxuries like new bandages, saline solution, disinfectant, sharp scalpel blades, and the list goes on. Because just like regulating the price of toilet paper made it impossible to find, making healthcare free just makes healthcare impossible to get when the government itself goes bankrupt. I'll leave you with one last anecdote from our time there. I mentioned earlier that we'd landed in Venezuela with 420 condoms on board. Now, a young couple named Ricky and Astrid, friends of the groom whose wedding we were attending, had spent the week looking after us, showing us the city, keeping us safe, ensuring we didn't get into any trouble along the way. They did a great job and we had an absolute blast. And as they were dropping us off at the airport, I remembered we still had all those condoms and the excess toilet paper too, all in our suitcase. So I said, Ricky, wait. And I unzipped the suitcase and I started handing over box after box of condoms through the passenger window. Now, we knew from chatting with him earlier in the week that he was pretty street smart, and there was no doubt in my mind that he would find somewhere to sell them on the black market. They were going to do a lot more good in Venezuela than they were ever going to do in my suitcase, so it made sense. As I handed over box after box, Ricky began to get emotional. It was weird. Well, okay, we were handing boxes of condoms through the open window of a car in front of the airport terminal while security watched on. Of course it was weird. But what I'm trying to say is that his response was deep. It was powerful. He was stunned. We said farewell and Ricky and Astrid drove off, and I found myself thinking about Ricky's reaction, and then I realised we'd been joking with Ricky earlier in the week about selling those condoms on the street just for a lark, and he assured us that they would fetch about $1 each on the black market. Because the Venezuelan government had made condoms essential and regulated the price so that people could afford them, they'd become completely unaffordable in a country where the average monthly income was about $30 per month. A single condom on the black market was literally worth a day's wages. And we'd just handed over 420 of them, well over a year's income for Ricky at that time. I found out later that Ricky used that money from those condoms to buy a simple ring and propose to Astrid. She said yes. And they were then able to buy their way out of Venezuela, and they now live in Florida in the USA. They have 2 children. And I hope someday to be able to return to the US and see them again in their new life, which we, in a way, kind of accidentally gave to them in the form of boxes of condoms at the airport that day. Now, what does all this have to do with what's happening in Argentina right now? Well, Argentina was the wealthiest country on earth in the late 1800s. That sounds like a long time ago, but if you compare what's happened in Argentina since then against the other wealthy countries from the same time, the contrast is stark. Because for the last 100 years, Argentina has lurched from one crisis to another as they've been ruled relentlessly by socialists, communists, and fascists. But I repeat myself. Through the slow decay of the exact same policies that I saw with my own eyes in Venezuela, Argentina has gradually collapsed in on itself under the weight of bad monetary policy, nationalisation of industry, government spending and debt, price controls, unsustainable welfare and more. Now, if those sound exactly like the kinds of mistakes that we're making in Australia right now, you're right. Australia is on the road to Argentina right now, and Argentina is on the road to Venezuela. But Argentina is showing some signs of hope, some signs that maybe, just maybe, they've learnt something through all the suffering of the last 100 years, and that maybe, just maybe, they're willing to try something different from the heavy and destructive socialism that they've endured for a century. And maybe, just maybe, they're going to chart a path out and show the world what a libertarian society can do, throw off the shackles of socialism and enjoy the peace and prosperity that freedom can bring. It's not a sure thing yet. In fact, it's far from it. But given that Australia is on the pathway to Venezuela via Argentina, I believe it's worth spending this entire episode looking at this remarkable moment in Argentine history and learning whatever lessons we can. So please, enjoy this Aussie Wire Argentina special. Long-time followers of mine will have heard a lot of that introduction already, me talking about my time in Venezuela when my wife and I were there and what we saw and what we learned. Well, of course, there's nothing quite like growing up in these countries, and so my next guest, here to talk especially about a fascinating happenstance, something that's taking place right now in real time in Argentina, is an Argentine national, also a friend. I'm very, very, very lucky to be able to say that I met her recently at the Friedman Conference, and we actually shared the stage together. Dr. Melissa Albacete, thank you so much for coming on the Aussie Wire.
Thank you so much, Topher, for inviting me. It's an honor to be with you.
This feels really sort of serendipitous because you and I met and we talked about, I talked about Venezuela at the Friedman Conference on stage there. You talked about Argentina, and you've got an immense amount of research and data that I know you'll be sharing with us soon. And then all of a sudden, barely 6 weeks later, here we are with a really unexpected situation unfolding in Argentina right now. For those that aren't aware, and I haven't told the viewers yet in this episode what exactly is happening. So for those that aren't aware, can you bring us up to speed? What is unfolding right now in Argentina?
What is happening in Argentina is crazy at the moment, especially for people who loves libertarianism, freedom, and liberal ideas. So at the moment, the primary elections, we got primary elections on Sunday, and the Libertarian candidate won the elections. Although this is primary elections, doesn't mean that he's going to become president. He got 30%, and he beat the current, government and the opposition, who are, big parties at the moment. So no one expected this outcome. The polls were suggesting that Javier Milei, who is the Libertarian candidate, will come up third. And all of a sudden, he came up in the first place.
Now, just before you go on, it's probably worth discussing the Argentinian presidential election system, because it is quite different to the US presidential election system. So correct me if I'm wrong, but as I understand it, all of the candidates are put forward in what's called a primary. It's different to the American primaries. And then is it the top two then go into a runoff against each other?
So the primaries, it basically selects the candidates who wants to run for president.
Right.
So you need to basically be over 1.5% of the vote to become a candidate for president. So you might have 10, 20 candidates for presidents. And then you have the actual elections.
Okay.
In the actual elections, yes. So there has to be, let's say one candidate gets over 45% of the votes, and second comes less than 40, with a 10% difference, the first one will become president. If not, you have a run-up, and you have, the two most voted will go for balotage, which is the French term for the second round.
Yeah. So can we put our finger on why? What's the message? Why is it that people have really resonated with and thrown their support behind a libertarian party, which, as much as I'm a libertarian and I love libertarianism, we are traditionally a niche political philosophy. It's very unusual to see a situation like this. Why has this happened?
Well, to be honest, I think there is a huge dissatisfaction with the current government, and as well as the opposition coalition. That's has opened up a space for non-traditional candidates such as Javier Milei. But what I think that happened is Javier Milei has been exposed at least for 10 years in public media at the moment. He's been educating people on libertarianism and liberal ideas. So we have, let's say, young people of my age, even younger, than they read Mises, they read Hayek, they read Milton Friedman. They confront the status quo. That's what Milei has been doing in the last 10 years. There are kids in high school who are confronting their teachers. And say, no, well, Mrs. says this. No, this is not correct. We've been suffering, from inflation this amount of years. So what you are teaching us is not correct. So that's what happened. And I think people bought those ideas because they are good ideas and they work. And actually, Argentina was the richest country in the world in 1896, 95. And there is proof that it worked. It worked. So we want to go back to there.
Yeah, and collectivism in its various forms, so at the fascist end of the scale, but also the communist end of the scale, the socialist end of the scale, has been a big problem for the South American continent. And we've seen time and again countries, Venezuela being an example I gave during the editorial at the start of this episode, who were among the wealthiest countries in the world, just absolutely crashing and collapsing, in the case of Venezuela, down to being among the poorest in the world with a completely dysfunctional healthcare system. They can't feed themselves, etc. And people assume that sort of thing can't happen here. You grew up in Venezuela. What was your sense of the future of Venezuela as a young person growing up? Could you ever have imagined things would get to the point where they are right now?
If my fear with Australia at the moment, if people believe that government interventionism and the bigger the government, the better, are the correct way to go. And what I found, especially in young kids here in Australia, is a lack of self-esteem. And they think that by, putting all their hope to government or someone to look after them, they will make the country better. Right. And this is not correct. And that I've seen this all my life in Argentina. So we need to shift that, way of thinking. And what we need to do is basically tell them, no, this is not correct. These ideas never worked in modern history at all. And what you're going to end up is having a country like Venezuela, having a country like Argentina. Well, I don't want to say, Cuba or North Korea or Vietnam. That's very extreme. But since you are undermining the liberal institutions, and the way to do that is through ideas, ideas will change institutions. And if you change institutions, you will end up having countries like Argentina and Venezuela, because you have a group of people who are already brainwashed, claiming for socialist institutions. But the hope is there. And although it happened in Argentina for more than 100 years, it's waking up. People understood that, and this is what Javier Milei did, exposing himself and explaining why those ideas never worked. And it's not only explaining the people are living, poverty at this point in Argentina. We have 115% of inflation. Poverty has rocketed. And insecurity has, rocketed. And people is completely, exhausted. They are fed up. And that's why they decided to vote for someone who at least they are very open. He's open, he's honest, and he's telling the people how he's going to, what the policies he wants to implement. He's speaking to them, with the truth and saying why it's necessary and how he's going to do it.
Well, that
losing voters.
I want to pick up on that, Melissa, because this is quite unusual. Politicians usually speak in platitudes, in feel-good kind of sound bites, but Javier Milei is definitely speaking in quite precise and clear, I am going to do X, Y, and Z. Can you share with us a few of those things off the top of your head, just to give those that aren't familiar with what's going on some idea of the actual policies that are clearly resonating with voters in Argentina?
Oh, yes. So the basically, his about, his ideas is about the currency and the shutting down the central bank. And he's been explaining why central banks, never work. And in Argentina particularly, Argentina is an outlier, statistically speaking. It's an outlier in economic history, and has basically increasing inflation for more than 100 years. So he has proposed drastically, lowering taxes and cutting, public spending, implementing the voucher system to use, the public health care and education system, closing or privatizing all state-owned enterprises, eliminating most of the ministries. So the current government has 18 ministries.
Right.
He's planning to cut 10 and have only 8.
Yep.
And he doesn't have anything to lose.
Yeah.
He's been in power. He's a newbie. So he's not afraid of losing, because if I lose, I'll do economics again. I'll go back and teach economics and go back to the private sector. So that's why he's very keen, and he explains really well. He's a very good teacher how he's going to do things, and people love him, definitely.
Well, it's worth reiterating there. You mentioned it, but just in passing, he is actually a lecturer, a teacher in economics. It's not like he's read a book and decided, oh, hey, that sounds great. He actually understands this to the point that he teaches it to other people. And clearly he's been investing the last 10 years, like you've said, communicating with the people of Argentina and educating them. Well, Melissa, I hope for the very best for your home country of Argentina. I've never been further south than Colombia and Venezuela, but I've always had ambitions of heading further south. And I have to say, Argentina might be about to give me a really good reason to get off my backside and get on a plane and get down there. What can we expect timeline-wise? When are the presidential elections, assuming there is a runoff? How soon is this all going to be over, and we'll actually know for sure what the outcome is?
So the presidential elections are on the 22nd of October, and if there is a second round, I don't know the date exactly, but it might be in November.
Yep.
Definitely, if we have a president, the new government will start on the 10th of December.
Right, so it's this year where we will know. We will know. This is in the world of politics, and especially in the world of libertarian politics, this is high drama. This is the most excitement we've had in a very long time. Well, Melissa Albacete, thank you so much for joining us here on the Aussie Wire. Very, very grateful for your time. Thank you for bringing us this story, and we will have you back on as it unfolds. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Topher. My pleasure.
Well, given what's happening in Argentina, I wanted to speak to someone who understands a little bit about how a presidential campaign might work from the inside. What's going on in Argentina that gives this outsider a realistic shot? And I could think of no one better than the former US Libertarian Party vice presidential candidate, Spike Cohen. Spike joins me now from the US. Spike, how are you?
I'm doing great, Topher. Thanks for having me on again, man.
How is the jet lag going back from Australia? You were just here for the Friedman Conference. How did you pull up on the way back?
So I think the fact that I don't really have any circadian rhythms of which to speak have served me well in my world travels. I just find if I take enough naps after a day or so, I feel normal. It didn't bother me on the way there, and it didn't really bother me on the way back. I was actually surprised that it didn't, but thank you for asking. I fared well.
Well, that's what they say. If you're in the military and you have no plan, then there's no chance of your enemy finding out what it is. So if you have no circadian rhythms, there's no chance of them getting
similar
disturbed.
Dynamic. Yes,
I love it.
Yes.
Now you ran as the Libertarian Party in the US vice presidential candidate, not once, but I think twice, because you're a glutton for punishment. Tell me a little bit about the experience of running for a job that is that big and that significant, but for a party that is really very much in the US, and I don't mean to be derogatory, but it's a very small, very niche party, and compared to your competitors for the role, you would have had basically no resources. What's the reality of that like on the ground?
It is the most rewarding and one of the most rewarding and certainly the most challenging thing that I've ever done. Keep in mind, just to put it in perspective, without any challenge, the Libertarian Party is the third largest political party in the United States. There's no one that even comes close to third. But that's in the same way of saying that if you had a minivan and a sedan and a Matchbox car, that the Matchbox car would be the third largest of those three cars. We definitely have a duopoly two-party system. And the main thing that's feeding that is the first past the post system that we have. And then also all the ballot access restrictions and everything they put in place. And all all of those things have fed into a narrative that the average American voter has, that you really have to pick from Team Red or Team Blue, even if you like fundamentally hate both of them. But it is an incredibly challenging thing. I will say I did only run the one time. We'll see what may happen in the future. But it was definitely incredibly challenging, because what the common refrain that I would hear from people when I would campaign and they'd come out to my events or when I do interviews and everything else, I'd hear people say, I love what you're saying. I agree with you 100%. I'm sick of this two-party system. You're not going to win. I can't vote for you. And it was just incredibly frustrating.
Well, that's one of the dynamics about the first past to the post, the US system. So there's multiple different ways of running elections. We do talk about this sort of thing from time to time here on the Aussie Wire. In Australia, we have a preferential system that allows you, in a situation like yours, for example, I would be able to say, right, I'm going to vote for Spike Cohen as the Libertarian Party number one, and then I might put the Republican or Democrat candidate as my number two. And if Spike doesn't get enough to get in, then my vote still carries on and still influences the outcome. And I think it's a lot easier in that context for someone to get a bit of traction as a third party, because people aren't throwing away their vote as they would see it. Now, the Argentinian system is interesting. It's a bit more, there's a lot of European powers that have systems like this where all the candidates go up against each other. And then essentially, I'm grossly oversimplifying, but the top two then go into a bit of a runoff against each other. What do you think the situation in Argentina is like? And what do you think the Libertarian candidates' chances are there in a runoff? Are they going to pick up a lot of the votes from one side or the other?
I think that he's going to pick up a lot of votes for a reason that has little to do with the electoral system. Argentina has 100% inflation. Their economic system is collapsing. Crime is going through the roof. You know, when an economic system collapses, everything else goes with it. And so a man who is literally saying, I am going to purge the political class, or political caste, I am going to shutter or abolish most of the government agencies out there. I'm going to slash spending. I'm going to shut down our central bank. I'm going to peg our currency to the US dollar because their 8 to 10% inflation is far better than our 100% inflation. All of that is like music to the ears of people. And now that it is just a binary choice between Javier Milei and the status quo, I do think he's going to pick up a lot of votes. You mentioned their system that they have. Basically, if you can't, in the first round, or the primary as they call it, if you can't get 45% or more, then it's the top two vote getters move on to the next race. But it goes even deeper than that, because in their legislative elections, they use a proportional representation system similar to what Australia uses. So, for example, Freedom Advances, I'm not going to try to say it in Spanish, but the coalition, the Libertarian coalition that Javier is a part of, it only got 17% of the vote in order for him to make it to the Chamber of Deputies, which is their version of the lower house of their legislature. It is that exposure from getting that 17% and being an elected official and calling for a completely stark departure of what everyone else is calling for that has led to him potentially becoming the next president of Argentina.
It's quite an astonishing thing, and I've got very close ties with Venezuela. I spent some time there and saw the devastation that socialist policies have wreaked on that part of the continent in the north of South America. But the South American continent has a long history of flopping between fascist dictators and communist dictators. Is there a risk here that this is almost still just a reactionary moment in time that they potentially it'll dissolve within a few years of a change of presidency?
Anytime that people are this frustrated and this desperate against the status quo, there is always that risk that it could end up devolving into something far worse. We saw that with the Weimar Republic in Germany. We saw that with the reaction to Chiang Kai-shek in China, or Batista in Cuba, or the aristocracy, the royal family in Russia. All of those led to ostensibly worse things than what they replaced, far worse than what they replaced. I think that the fact that we have someone who is an Austrian-trained economist and who is channeling that populist anger into something that's actually going to yield good results, not with some kind of, he's not promising utopia. He's saying we're going to eliminate the problem or greatly reduce the problem by greatly reducing the government. And so, I never say that something bad couldn't happen, but I think that if he does get elected, I think that it appears to be that they'll be in good hands, and the good hands will be someone recognizing that it needs to be in their hands and not his, and putting the power back in their hands. So I'm hopeful.
That's a big difference. I'm optimistic as well, but the caution that's ringing in the back of my mind is the experience of Mikhail Saakashvili, the former president of Georgia, who came in on an anti-corruption platform, slashed the public service, dramatically reduced the size of government, gave people a lot of their freedom back, and in the process upset a lot of those people who were obviously on the government teat or had those government jobs or had those little petty bureaucracies and the petty power that they bring, and found himself thrown out on his ear at the very next election. So fingers crossed that's not what we're going to see here. But Spike, before I let you go, what is life after running as a vice presidential candidate in the US elections like? What happens when all the noise and fury dies down, the election happens, you weren't elected? What now?
What now is I realize that we have a long way to go in building a culture of liberty, not just here in the States, but across the planet. It's not just enough to try to get elected, because if you're getting elected and the electorate doesn't recognize that freedom is actually the best way forward, then you're not going to get anywhere. You're either not going to get elected, or you're going to get elected by watering down your message or promising things that you can't possibly deliver, and then you're no better than what you replaced, right? So what I'm doing now is the organization I created called You Are the Power. And what we do is we are finding people who are being abused by their local governments. We organize our membership, 3,000 strong and growing, and the members of that local community to organize around the people in that cause. And we show people that the status quo that we're fighting is tyranny, is oppression, and that the alternative solution that we're providing is liberty. It is freedom. It is giving them their power back and respecting them as individual human beings. And we've had, in just over a year, we've had incredible results. We have thousands of members across the country. We've worked on dozens of causes across the country. Leaving Australia, we are actually in the process of opening an Australian chapter of You Are the Power. So stay tuned on that. Yeah, and so it's incredible. And so if anyone wants to find out more about it, I invite you to go to youarethepower.net. But the reality is, electoral politics is one of the tools that we have to fight for freedom. There are cultural tools, there are technological tools, there are activism tools, and we need to use the entire slate of tools and not put our eggs all in one basket. And that's what I'm doing with You Are the Power.
Couldn't agree more. Thank you so much for coming on and giving us a bit of an insider's perspective on presidential politics. Fingers crossed for Argentina. Let's hope that they are about to make one of the best decisions they've made in decades. Spike, thanks for coming on.
Thank you, Topher.
Well, so far in this special report on the Aussie Wire, we've heard from an Argentinian, all about Argentinian politics and the situation over there, especially the economics and the last 100 years of history. We've also heard from Spike Cohen, a veteran campaigner as a libertarian and someone who's very aware of just how hard it is for libertarian politics to really get traction pretty much anywhere, which is what makes what's happening in Argentina right now so fascinating. But now, for me at least, we get to the rub. What would the impact actually be of someone, a libertarian, actually being in a position like the president in a place like Argentina? What sorts of policies would someone like that have to pursue, and what sorts of results could we expect? So I invited back Professor Sinclair Davidson for the second time onto the Aussie Wire. He's an economist, and he's here to hopefully answer some of my questions. Professor Davidson, thank you so much for coming back on the Aussie Wire.
Thank you for having me, Topher.
Now, we were discussing just before we began recording off air, you've actually been to Argentina once before, and you loved it just as I loved my time in Venezuela, despite all of the many challenges and difficulties. I think it's a part of the world that you can't help but fall in love with when you go there. It's a wonderful part of the world, and I certainly hope to see it have a much better future than it's had past. And that's why this moment in Argentinian politics, I feel, is so incredibly important and worth reporting on. Milei calls himself a libertarian. I have to agree. I've had a look at some of his policies. I tend to think that's a pretty good description. He is himself an economist. So what sorts of policies, if he were to become the president of Argentina, what sorts of policies should we be expecting from a libertarian economist president?
Well, he's actually got an impressive list of things he actually wants to achieve. So he's talking about privatization. He's talking about shutting down government departments. He actually intends to have just 8 government departments when he's finished shutting things down. He's talking about cutting government spending by 15%. Now, right now, government spending in Argentina is about 36%. To put that number into context, here in Australia, government spending is about 26%. So there's a lot of government spending. He wants to cut 15% of that. He wants to privatize. He wants to shut down government departments. He wants to close down their central bank. He wants to dollarize their economy. He wants to do something about inflation. Now, just to give you some perspective, inflation in Argentina is running at about 116%. Interest rates in Argentina are running at 118%. Now, you cannot possibly live in a society where inflation is at that kind of very high level, because at the end of the day, you just don't know what prices are. You don't know how to plan. So when I went to Argentina, very often people would quote you a US dollar price anyway. So the fact of the matter is people are using US dollars for pricing anyway. They're using US dollars for transacting anyway. So more or less, he's coming along and saying, look, the inevitable is our currency is worth nothing. It's useless. Let's actually move to a hard currency. This is actually an incredibly good policy to have. It's the kind of thing the Argentinians and almost all South American economies should be doing. And frankly, some of them have done it in the past, and it has not always been that successful. So it's probably one of those things that are easier said and hard to do properly. And we know from the recent UK experience of Prime Minister Truss, where she also came in with what we would describe as a libertarian style policy arrangement. And the establishment managed to get rid of her pretty quickly. People of a certain age will remember a book in the 1980s called A Very British Coup, where the establishment got rid of a left-wing prime minister. Well, we saw a very British coup. The establishment got rid of a right-wing, because when you're a libertarian, of course, you're always some crazy right-winger. But the thing to bearing in mind is that if you want to be radical, like he wants to be radical. If you want to be radical, you have to be organized. You have to do things properly. You have to actually have a systematic plan of achieving your goals. And that is where I don't know where he's at. And I think that's very often a mistake libertarians make, is you kind of get into we're going to get rid of the central bank, which is a fantastic policy to have. But of course, what are you going to do next? How are you going to get rid of the central bank? So if you think of they want to dollarize the economy, it's called, well, they can literally just peg the exchange rates like they've done in the past, and the government's got to stand ready to buy and sell currency to maintain the peg. Pegged exchange rates always get attacked, because there's a lot of money to be made in attacking pegged exchange rates, and they always get attacked. But then there's a thing that they could bring in, a currency board. Now, Hong Kong has operated a currency board for many, many years, and I'm trying to think of the precise number off the top of my head. It's either 7.2 or 7.8 Hong Kong dollars to the US. And they simply, you turn up with your US dollar, and they will give you the equivalent Hong Kong dollars, and they will simply buy them back and forth from you at that particular rate. Currency boards actually work very, very well. The other thing that they could do is allow currency competition. Now, currency competition comes along where you simply say, look, the Argentina peso is no longer legal tender. Two people can barter and exchange, and at any exchange rate that they like, using any currency that they like. So that's another option. And I kind of think that's the option I would go for, because people in the economy are already using US dollars. Now, what is going to happen is that if they don't have their own independent currency, they can't have their own independent monetary policy. Now, as a libertarian, I'm thinking, score. I mean, how awesome is that? Because governments get things horribly wrong. We only have to look at our own central bank to realize what can go wrong there. So if a government is going to step back from monetary policy and say, look, money is actually something to help people in the economy trade with each other, and we're not going to get involved, that's a fantastic policy. But there's a lot of explanation that needs to go into that policy. Now, the thing is, the Argentinians know exactly what can go wrong when your money is wrong. So they don't need that much explanation, but the rest of the world does. So when the election results came out, people started dumping the Argentinian peso on world markets. So there was this negative reaction, because people around the world can't conceive of the idea of there not being a government money.
Now, we've covered an enormous amount of ground there. I need to rewind a little bit because
Sure.
for people that aren't economists, for mere mortals like me, there's a couple of things I need to touch on. You talked about a dramatic reduction, 15% reduction in government spending, the abolition of who knows how many government departments in that process. There's a lot of people for whom that would strike fear into their hearts. But clearly, it's striking people differently in Argentina. We can see the results of this primary election where he got the most votes out of any party, including out of the two parties that have traditionally ruled Argentina. So this idea of dramatically cutting government size and spending is getting a positive reaction there. But for many Australians, they'd be terrified of that thought. Why is there that disconnect?
Because bad government is a lived experience. And the Argentinians have now lived this experience, and they are genuinely saying, let's try something new and different. Bearing in mind, we've had those same two parties govern Argentina for 100 years.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, a third-party candidate comes along. He's an economist, and he's speaking sense to people, and he's saying, let's give it a go, do something different. I mean, how much worse can it get? It really hurts me to say this, but government in Australia is not as bad as Argentina. And on many senses, our government is reasonably good. If you were to say to me, let's get rid of the Australian dollar, I would say, it works well enough for what it is.
Yeah.
The Argentinian peso is just not working well for anybody. Yeah. So bad government is a lived experience. And it's very hard to explain to people that bad government is a lived experience because here in Australia, we have reasonably good government, all things considered. Other things that he's doing, privatization raises revenue. A lot of those government departments, you go through them and you say, what do you really do?
Yeah.
And probably a lot of them are some employment generators. And very often you are sucking out people into the public sector who should actually be in the private sector, earning an income, being entrepreneurial, all that sort of stuff. Other things that he's doing that I really like is he's going to bring in a school voucher system. And, when you start talking to parents, mums and dads, we are going to give you the money for you to decide what's best for your child.
Yeah.
Those sorts of things become popular. The challenge, though, is, of course, what's popular with the electorate isn't always popular with the elites and isn't always popular with the people who have to pass the laws through. I think in Argentina, they call it a Congress. Yeah. So the parliament equivalent. The people who've got to pass those laws may not be the same people. So there are always those challenges in implementation. But a person comes along and says, I'm going to cut government spending, I'm going to dollarize the economy, I'm going to give people school vouchers, I'm going to privatize stuff, I'm going to shut down entire departments of government. If you have school vouchers, you don't need a Department of Education. Yeah. All those inspectors, all those bureaucrats are actually going to be gone. Whereas the person who's still standing in front of your classroom teaching your kids, they are still going to be there.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's what mums and dads want to hear. So these are all good policies. So it makes a lot of sense.
Well, this is an incredibly important experiment, if I may say. And obviously, he hasn't won the presidency yet. There are question marks about how much of his agenda will he really be able to pursue, given that legislation will need to be passed. All of those caveats, I guess. But I think for Australia, this is actually a really important moment, because if he is able to implement some of these ideas, and the world doesn't end the way that many people will be predicting that it will, then I think it'll be a teaching moment. We obviously have people who are pushing for a school voucher system here in Australia. I support that as an initiative. I'd certainly love to see entire government departments disappear, and a 15% reduction in government spending would be a great start. But I do want to finish on a cautionary tale. We saw, and I mentioned this in one of the earlier interviews in this episode, Mikhail Saakashvili, the one-time president of Georgia, was elected as on a corruption-busting platform. He became libertarian in the pursuit of busting corruption. The way that he did it was abolishing entire departments and just getting rid of the need for people to go to the government for permission for things. So he became a libertarian in that sense, but his aim was to eliminate corruption. What happened was he was thrown out on his ear in very short order because, of course, as you rightly mentioned, a lot of these things are jobs for the boys schemes. And when all the boys lose their jobs, and there's a lot of angry people out there who at least know someone who lost their jobs and they lost their opportunity for graft, these people can turn around and make quite a lot of trouble. Now, in Mikhail's case, he ended up in prison and actually exiled from the country, and his citizenship was revoked, and he ended up actually stateless for quite some time. It's an extraordinary story, and I hope to have him on the show at some point in time. What is your read on this? Is this a moment, an aberration, a Mikhail Saakashvili type moment that then springs back to where things were before? Or do you really think there's an opportunity here for a South American country, contrary to their usual style, to actually chart a new course towards a freer type of society and to actually keep it up?
I'm always very hopeful that when you have these sort of maverick politicians appear, that this is going to be a learning moment, that this is going to be a change in direction. Bearing in mind, though, it is an uphill battle for any reformer to do anything. Already we see how he's been framed.
Yes.
He's been framed like a Bolsonaro from Brazil, or he's been framed like a Trump. The headlines here in Australia is that, not that he's an economist, but that he's a tantric sex instructor. So already he's been framed.
No wonder he's popular.
He's been framed as being some sort of weirdo. But in actual fact, when you look at his policies and what he says and what he does, he's more of a Thatcherite or a Reagan.
Yeah.
Now, bearing in mind, those Thatcher and Reagan sort of through sheer force of will carried the United States and the United Kingdom from where they were in a terrible dark place in the 1970s, more or less back to being powerhouses. We know historically Argentina has been a very wealthy economy, and the Peronist parties and some of their populisms and what have you have basically impoverished that country, where today 40% of the population are below the poverty line. So you're kind of hoping that in those situations, when everybody has tried everything else, we try to do the right thing. But again, he's up against entrenched elites, which is going to be a challenge for him. It's going to be a challenge for everybody. And of course, when he fails, it will be, it's not the entrenched elites that caused him to fail. It was his crazy radical ideas and what have you. So they're already setting him up to fail. So it is going to be a very difficult path forward, but certainly very sensible ideas coming out of him. I particularly like, he wants to get rid of sex education in schools. That's close to my heart. That kind of indoctrination of young children is disgraceful. The only negative that I can say about him is he wants to negotiate with the United Kingdom for the Falkland Islands. I've also been to the Falkland Islands. There is no chance. So he should focus more on privatization and cutting government spending and all those good things. And hopefully he gets elected when the actual election turns up. I think it's in November.
Yeah, a little bit later this year. And then there may be a runoff after that as well. Well, Professor Sinclair Davidson, thank you so much. That line of yours, that bad government is a lived experience, that I think is the quote of the episode. I think that's just such a good thing to keep in mind, and certainly was my experience down here in Melbourne during all the COVID madness and nonsense. Getting someone who wasn't there to actually understand it is almost impossible. You just have to have actually lived it. For the people of Argentina, hopefully their experience of bad government is going to soon come to an end, but we'll just have to cross our fingers and hope for the best. Professor Davidson, thank you so much for coming on the Aussie Wire.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for watching the Aussie Wire. We release new episodes every Tuesday and Thursday at 4 p.m. You can catch up on past episodes at theaussiewire.com. Be sure to join our email list while you're there as well. And please consider becoming an insider, a financial supporter of the Aussie Wire, where you'll get giveaways, discounts, exclusive content, our insiders community, and much more. The link is in the description. Thank you for watching our Argentina special. I'm Topher Field, and this is the Aussie Wire.